Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Nice to have you here. Welcome, welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies, where we offer university-level learning without the quizzes, no sororities, and no football games. So we're delighted that you're here. And this year, once again, I'm going to be teaching with my dear partner, Professor Stephen Windmuller. So really glad everybody's here. We're going to do what we always do to wake up, which is ask you to stand up, turn around to the folks beside you and wish them good evening, say hello, introduce yourself. Good. And if you'll join me now in a blessing as we get started. Ready? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And because we're together, and it's nice to be together, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Amen. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. We want to wish Douglas a happy birthday. Happy birthday, Doug. Many more in good health. Well, like a fiddler on the roof. Sounds crazy, no? But in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a little tune without breaking our necks. Why do we stay there if it's so dangerous? Because this is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition. Not bad. Tradition. We have traditions for everything. How to eat, how to sleep, even how to wear clothes. Because of our traditions, everyone knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Tradition. We Jews love this idea of tradition. It gives us a deep sense of authenticity to know that we do the things that our ancestors did, that we are part of an unbroken chain of tradition, going all the way back to Abraham and Sarah, and through the days of the Bible, and through the days of the Talmud, and through the Middle Ages and into modernity, and our children will do the same following us. This idea of tradition. This is a very, very powerful value in our way of doing things, in our thinking. And we understand that what kept us alive, what Tevye says, how did we keep our balance in a world that's so dangerous? What's kept us alive all of these generations is our tenacity of holding on to that tradition, our devotion to that tradition, our commitment to that tradition, to keep doing these things, to keep teaching these values, to keep this way of life. And that's true. The reason we're still here after so many thousands of years is because generation to generation, we kept these values and kept this way of life. That's true, but it's only half true. The other half of the truth is something we don't talk about too much, which is the other reason we stayed alive so long is because we changed. We know how to change. We are particularly good at changing. Sometimes those changes were forced upon us by events from outside. Sometimes those changes welled up from within. But we have a particular genius for changing. And that's what we're going to be talking about together, Professor Windmuller and I. Because we're in a moment of change. Right now, I would tell you that the moment of change has three different levels, and we'll talk about this in some detail. But the first level is for the last 300 years, we've been figuring out how to live with modernity. And that's what Fiddler on the Roof is all about. And then in the 20th century, we had three events which shook the foundations of Jewish life: the Holocaust in its horror, the reemergence of the State of Israel in its glory, and American democracy that we enjoy. And the question is, how do you be a Jew under those circumstances? And then the third one just happened, October 7th, which has really changed a lot of our ways of thinking about ourselves and about the world that we live in. So we thought it would be a good idea, as we get into this process of change, to look back through our history and understand how we did it. Because there are clues, there are actually patterns of understanding how we changed and how we might change now. And one of the things I'm going to show you in a few minutes when it's my turn to teach, because I'm going to give it over to the professor in a moment, is a really interesting observation. One of the reasons we know so much about Jewish change is because we wrote it up. We have these books in our tradition, and we call them traditional books. And they're usually bound big leather books with big bindings. Bible, Talmud, Mishnah, these great books, right? And we think of these books as tradition. Your grandfather owned these books. Your great-grandfather owned these books. But here's the great irony. Those books were not written in moments when tradition was ruling the world. They were written in the wake of a revolution. In other words, those books are not about tradition. Those books are actually about change. Because when things are going along the way tradition tells you to do them, you don't need to write a book. The reason you write a book is because you're in the middle of a change. And you want people to understand the change and know how to live the change. So the great books of Jewish tradition are actually books of Jewish revolution. And that way we can open those books and learn, how did they do it? How did they make these changes and not either lose their minds or lose their faith or lose the connection with their past? How did they do it? That's going to be our great question. So tonight we're going to begin. We're going to ask the professor to teach first. Then we're going to open up the Bible. Next week we're going to talk about the Talmud and how Rabbinic Judaism, that is Judaism of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, created changes. Then we're going to talk about the Jewish Middle Ages. That doesn't mean between 40 and 60. That means after the destruction of the Holy Temple into Europe and the rest of the world during the Middle Ages. And then we're going to talk about Jewish modernity and how modernity changed things. And at the very end, we're going to come back to today. We're going to talk about what's changing now, what should change, how should we change it, and we're going to depend upon all of you as our laboratory to sort of help us figure this out. When we're done, we're going to have a blueprint for tomorrow's Judaism. You didn't know that you were being recruited. That's our aim tonight. I want to introduce my dear friend, Professor Steve Windmuller, has held every academic position in the Jewish community that matters, right? He was a professor at HUC, Hebrew Union College. He was the dean of HUC, Hebrew Union College. Then he tried to retire, and they kept bringing him back, right? He's the Shohei Ohtani of Jewish teachers, right? Every time he tries to sit on the bench, they say, come on in and pitch again. Anyway, he's my dear friend, and it's wonderful to learn with him, and we're honored to have him with us tonight. Steve.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein. And do not, but under no circumstances, do not go to coffee with this gentleman. Because the minute you do, you get into this extraordinary engagement in such subjects as tradition and Jewish change. And then you come away from that motivated to write an article. And indeed, the article is entitled In the Betweens, this notion of the periods of transition and transformation. And the other person you don't want to mess with is Ilana. I appreciate it. The irony is I'm going to move out of the way so that we don't mess things up. So if you cannot see the board, you may want to slide slightly to the insides to sort of see this. But more seriously, as the rabbi has introduced, our conversation over these 5 weeks will be to really explore these transformational moments and the extraordinary players, Jewish and sometimes others, who have helped sort of to rewire us, reconstitute what Judaism and the various Jewish traditions would look like. And the really fascinating piece of this is that in this moment, we are experiencing in so many different ways, through our democracy, through Israel, through the fight against anti-Semitism, all of these sort of elements coming together, creating this sort of tsunami of change, which we will, as the rabbi has suggested, address. We are living with and have lived with uncertainty in much of the history of the Jewish people, and we know that. I mean, that's precisely why this tradition is so dynamic, because it's always about the questions, and questions become central to every observance and practice that we are committed to. And it is tied to the encounters we have with the events surrounding us, the players with us, and the stories that we tell about ourselves and others. And in so many ways, what we want to do is unpack, as we've said, these moments, these transformational periods, in trying to deal with the dualities that we are experiencing. So what are we experiencing? The series of kinds of revolutionary changes. Now, our teachers, scholars, and prophets did not use necessarily the word revolution, but there were revolutionary experiences happening. And these created a kind of emergence of something as a paradigm or something emerging to reshape who we were, what we were, and how we saw ourselves. And as we note, there are political impulses that create this. There are religious factors, revivalisms, and religious expressions that dominate this, as well as a kind of spiritual inquiry that talks to us about all of this. It's always about the search for something that holds truth, that holds meaning to us as a people and as a civilization. So I went to Hegel because I'm trained as a political scientist, and I saw Hegel's efforts at trying to understand human behavior and social change, moving from a kind of thesis or documentation of this is who we are, what we are, and how we operate, to this transformational moment of really dealing with the other side of this experience, the new ideas, the challenging positions, the interlopers, and the revolutionaries who come into our play, ultimately finding what he and others have described as synthesis, or the collective outcomes that give sort of acknowledgement to where we were, reflect what we are becoming, and ultimately lead us to this new point in time. So this dialectical process is really all about what these in-betweens are really about. So there were different periods, and as the rabbi pointed out, at each moment in Jewish history, people began to ask questions. At the time of the First Temple, how do you take Judaism from Jerusalem and make it viable and functional and user-friendly, if you wish? So that was a kind of engaging question in the destruction of Jerusalem, how to accomplish that. And I happen to have studied and worked with the two sort of scribes of that moment, Ezra and Nehemiah, because they are storytellers, and they are creating for us in Jerusalem how the Torah ought to be retaught to a community that has been divided and fled and has come back and is intermarried and is creating all kinds of controversies, and how these two negotiate these same issues. How do you bring back tradition? How do you deal with new audiences? How do you incorporate those audiences? And each approaches it distinctively. As an example of what we are now talking about, these moments of recreation. Or we might take a look here in the United States how American Judaism itself emerged, and look at the reformers, the conservative Jewish leadership, and certainly more traditionalists who said, no, not all of this change, only parts of this change. And those who rejected all of that to sort of hold to a kind of norm of traditional behavior. So this is not just a story of 586 before the Common Era, it is a story of our own lives and of our own evolution as an American Jewish community. Or it might reflect the rise of Zionism and the challenges of what Zionism represented. And the early reformers at the Pittsburgh platform of the 1800s, 1880s, rejecting Zionism, saying, America is our Zion, and we don't need this idea of a reborn Jewish state. So it's this real interesting dilemma and dynamic that is happening. Or 1945, where we encounter and try to deal with what was this experience about, the Shoah? And how do we understand it? How do we teach it? How do we memorialize it? And how do we tie it into our story moving forward? And so that too becomes part of this questioning of each new moment and each new encounter, challenging us, challenging our great thinkers, many of whom helped to frame the modern ideologies and thought processes of not only how we teach the Shoah, but how we really have embedded it into Jewish life and culture. And even in this moment, as the rabbi pointed out, October 7th and beyond, and the understanding of national religious Zionism, which is part of the formation of the 37th government of the State of Israel, and what this government represents, and how those ideas run up against some of us, and our liberal inclinations on Zionist thought. And so what kind of democratic Jewish state will we see evolve post-Gaza? And what will it look like in next year's election? Because the Israelis will, by law, be required by October of 2026 to have a national election. And that will be a very telling moment of which storyline will emerge moving forward. Will the far right and its leadership evolve as the voice of Israel, or will other voices play out in this very critical moment? So all of this is about leadership in so many ways. It's about the players who make these decisions, who create these ideas, who lead the charge. And these leaders come in different forms, and what we will be looking at, whether they are biblical leaders, prophetic leaders, whether they are the great scholars of the Talmudic and medieval periods, or whether they are modernists. They all represent a different sort of frame of how, as a leader, they perceive the Jewish story. And how will we judge them? And how do we judge them? Our own leaders, as we would judge those who have come before us. It is also a process. And this is something that is not unique to the Jewish people. And I think we need to sort of step back and realize that every culture, every nation, every civilization struggles with these transformational in-between moments. And they are reflected in how they change the culture and how they influence historic movements and ideas and how they have created and supported and nurtured great empires, and how religious ideas, for example, get transferred and transformed as these empires sort of rule the world and shape the messaging of what is happening to people in all parts and spaces of the universe. And it's done through trade. One of the most interesting parts of Jewish history is to study the history of trade and port cities, because Jews were often living in port cities, and how those cities become the translators of all of these ideas, because as they encounter the merchants who are trading with them, they learn of different ideas about Jewish practice and culture, language, and experience. And it becomes a kind of listening point of hearing new thoughts about the Jewish people and the rise and place of different Jewish ideas. So this is very complex. This This is not simply studying history and sort of summarizing, well, you know, we have an outcome that is uniformly acceptable and that everyone concurs with who we are, what we are, and how we perform and believe and practice. We know that's simply not true because in so many ways we are multiple traditions wrapped up in this idea called Jews, Judaism, Israel, Zionism. And as we sort of play these themes out, we realize how these competitive ideas inform us or we reject them, but they are so alive within our tradition. And I also think that each of these stages that we will be studying gives us some new insights about the new normal and what we can expect to see and what we are experiencing in ways that we may have never thought about in coming to grips with what has happened. And it always introduces us to new players, to new people on the waterfront who are emerging, coming forward to share their ideas or their experiences or to teach us and to leave us with some legacy of value. Something very interesting is happening to us. And as the rabbi has indicated, our last session is really about figuring out what all of this tells us, means for us, and where we collectively have to make some decisions as to how we live in the world that is so rapidly changing. We used to depend on institutions to define and shape who we were, how we were, and the institutions, in a sense, negotiated all of this for us and with us. But now we are sovereign self. We are the ability to create sort of a self-expression, our own ways of identifying, participating, and engaging. So you ask your kids, for example, do they read newspapers? Most of them will say no. They get their connections, their sort of information from their peers and from social platforms and networks. And they have shaped their truths and their ideas through those informal themes. So institutions are even further removed for and from them. And as a result, we confront this moment in history where many institutions are being questioned and many beliefs about them are being challenged. More Americans have less confidence today in the institutions of government, of business, of education, of religion, and of civic society as a whole than at any other time in our history. And since 1970, those numbers about this level of truth or confidence in the value added of institutions and of traditions has clearly diminished, has clearly shown how far weaker those systems really are. And as a result, where once we could predict institutional structures, how they operate, how they behaved, and they created stability, we have a new reality, which we might call ambiguity and complexity and discontinuity, because we are uncertain and unsure of what to believe and with whom do we connect and what are the truths we collectively share. I wrote a piece in which I suggested an idea that the 19th century, for Jews and for others, created the great ideologies: Reform Judaism, conservative Jewish thought. Reconstructionism had some of its earlier thinking in the 1930s, but ideologies were generally a 19th century phenomenon, Zionism for sure. But the 20th century was where these institutions came into play that activated these ideologies. So the seminaries and the movements and the national Jewish organizations and the federated systems and all the structures we know were 20th century inventions. So we are here in the 21st century, great individuals as we are, sovereign self, having inherited a 19th century modality of ideas and a 20th century set of institutions, leaving us in the 21st century wondering, so where do we turn? And what does this all represent? So this is creating a sense of chaos It's also a crisis for democracies, but it is a moment in which all of this has been a disruptor. I'm just looking for, yes, I just wanted to deal with the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is AI, it's technology, it's everything we now experience in terms of the complexities of an age in which science and invention of ideas has so radically changed. We are reproducing information at such a fast pace that it's totally changed our ability to comprehend that what we learned a year ago may be already useless because it has been redefined and recreated in another form. So in this industrial revolution of the fourth era, it suggests that it is about science and technology, and it is about the question of the role that religion will play in this sort of new world. And it's this a fascinating idea that religion, often rejected and marginalized as something, well, that was of an earlier point in time, may actually have a very powerful place and role to play. So our job at the end of this effort will be to sort of navigate what that role looks like and how we recreate maybe the religious voice in the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you. So that's just to introduce all the work we're going to be doing. And as the rabbi said, there are no final papers or exams, but you will be called upon to recall some of this material at future points. So you want me to teach about Joshua now or a bit later?
Let me just do one
Yeah.
point of introduction.
Sure.
Then we'll start. Right, everybody okay? So the first book I read in college in the summer of 1971 when I was on my way to UC Santa Cruz, where I had long hair and crazy ideas, the summer before I went my freshman year, they sent us a reading assignment. And the name of the book was The Structure of Scientific Revolution by a man named Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn turns out to be a historian of science who was teaching at Princeton University. And The Structure of Scientific Revolution turns out to be one of the most important books of the late 20th century. And it was very hard to read. And I got really frightened because I said, heck, if this is what they give me as a freshman, how am I ever going to get through college? But as I got to college, I realized no one else understood this book either. And they brought this guy who was a physicist in to explain it to us. And this is what he told us. And this is what the book is really about. He says, when we think about science and how science progresses, how science keeps going forward, we think that science goes forward what's called incrementally. This discovery, and then this discovery, and then this discovery, and then this discovery, and it's a sort of like an uphill, a nice smooth uphill, or at least a staircase. That's how we think science works, right? Turns out that ain't the way science works. Kuhn says, if you look at the history of science, that's not the way it works. Here's how it works. Scientists all agree on a certain picture of the world. If you're an astronomer, it's a picture of the stars. If you're a geologist, it's a picture of rocks. If you're a biologist, it's a picture of life. If you're a physicist, it's a picture of, well, everything, right? And they have that picture. And what they do is that picture suggests experiments they ought to do. And that they go and do these experiments. And the experiments fill in the picture they already have. Until one day, somebody makes a discovery that doesn't fit the picture. That's called an anomaly. The most famous example you all remember. During the Middle Ages, the church and all of Europe held to a theory of the cosmos that was put together by an ancient Egyptian astronomer named Ptolemy. And somehow he had a P in his name, but his name was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy's universe was very simple. The Earth is in the center, and then there's all these spheres around the Earth. The first sphere is the sun and the moon, and then the next sphere is the stars, and the next sphere is the angels. And when you look up in the sky, that's what you see. right? You see the stars moving around the sky. You see the sun and the moon moving through the sky. And that's the Ptolemaic universe. Everybody got that? Then one day comes along a scientist by the name of Galileo. And he actually didn't invent it, he actually perfected something called a telescope. And he takes his telescope and he looks into the sky and he sees something that he didn't expect to see. He sees the planet Jupiter. And the planet Jupiter is surrounded by moons. Now, wait a minute, that can't be, because everything revolves around the Earth. How can there be moons around Jupiter? The Ptolemaic universe, that picture of the world put by Ptolemy, didn't allow for moons around Jupiter. And Galileo starts talking about this. Now, at that moment, what happened was that the Catholic Church ruled Europe, and the Catholic Church got very upset because they wanted to believe that the earth is the center of everything, because that's what they believe the Bible said. And if you tell me that there's moons around Jupiter, which means the Ptolemaic universe might not be right, which means that we may not be the center of God's universe, well, that's a huge mistake. There's a beautiful play by the playwright Bertolt Brecht called Galileo. They once played it on PBS. It's a beautiful thing. The bishops come to Galileo's workshop, and they say to him, and the telescope is sitting in the window, and the bishops say, either you recant, you take back what you've been talking about with those moons, or we're going to throw you out of the Catholic Church and you're going to spend eternity in hell. Galileo says, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I will recant what I discovered. All you got to do is take a peek in that telescope. And the bishop who brings the decree says, I can't, because he realizes that if he looks in that telescope, it's going to destroy his world. So what happens? Galileo actually did recant. The church didn't excommunicate him. He died, and his findings were published. And then the Ptolemaic universe is destroyed because it doesn't predict moons around Jupiter. But there was another astronomer by the name of Nico Copernicus who discovered many of the same things and had a different theory of how the world is set up, how the universe is set up. He, by the way, did not publish his findings in his lifetime because he also was afraid of getting excommunicated. The church was pretty mean back then, right? And what happens is when Copernicus' stuff is published, we begin to see the world differently. We don't see the earth at the center. We see ourselves as part of a solar system where the sun is the center. And that explains lots of things that Galileo and his successors saw. And today, we have a different vision of the universe. Everybody got that? When a science has a way of looking at the world, Kuhn, my author, called it a paradigm. Paradigm is an English word that means a model, a way of thinking, right? Kuhn is the one who made paradigm a common word. When we have a paradigm, and the progress of science works like this. We have a paradigm until somebody discovers an anomaly. And when they discover the anomaly, the paradigm falls apart. And you have revolutionary science, a time when we don't know exactly what to believe. And then someone comes up with a new paradigm, Copernicus. And that's called a paradigm shift. That phrase started to be used not just for astronomy, but for all science, and eventually for lots of other things. Now, you all know a little bit about science. You know that there once upon a time was a universe that was imagined by a wonderful scientist named Isaac Newton, right? And then what happened was we started building nuclear reactors and discovered subatomic particles. And guess what? Subatomic particles don't behave the way Newton says they should. So we threw away Newton's universe and we took up Einstein's universe. And then it turned out that Einstein's universe wasn't exactly right either, and so we threw that one away, and now we're onto something called quantum mechanics. Please don't ask me to explain that, because that's not my field. And the same thing happens in psychology, the same thing happened in biology. We were created in the image of God, until a dude named Darwin comes along and says, no, you're just a pretty intelligent monkey. Right? No one wanted to believe that, except it happens to be true, right? So this is called a paradigm shift. What the professor and I are going to argue today is that we're in a position of a paradigm shift in Judaism. but we've had these many times before. And that's the language we're going to use. So I wanted you to understand those words. Everybody got those words down? A paradigm shift is when you have to throw away the way you looked at the world and the things you were doing and adopt a new one. Because that's what the new discoveries force us to do. And sometimes there is a time between paradigms, and that's what the professor's talking about, between paradigms when we're not sure what we're supposed to believe. And then it becomes kind of uncomfortable because we all want to be certain about stuff, and this doesn't allow for any real certainty. So what I'm going to ask you to begin to do is to begin to develop a kind of perverse enjoyment of the uncertainty between paradigms. Because the uncertainty between paradigms might be a difficult time. You don't quite know what to believe, but it's also a time of tremendous creativity. Because if we don't have a paradigm, all kinds of things are possible. We can imagine all kinds of universes. And so there is a kind of enjoying that in between the paradigm time, because it can be really creative, really creative. In Judaism, you all know this, right? My great-grandfather was a very religious guy in Lithuania. I always imagine what would happen if he came here. I just imagine him walking into this building. 7:30 in the morning, there's a Tai Chi class made up of the mothers of the nursery school who come here. And I can just imagine my Alta Zeta coming in, and here's all these lovely young women in their Lululemon best going, and I can just imagine my Alta Zeta, my grandfather, who's a rabbi, would look at me and say, Edel, was is this? What is this? And how would I answer him? Because he knows what a shul is. And a shul doesn't have, and so I imagine one thing I have to say to him is, gedavening, they're praying. Oh, they're praying. Oh, gedavening epis. Yeah, okay. I mean, because you understand that what we have now is not what our ancestors had. We're going to see, I'm going to bring you a text next week from the Talmud in which the rabbis imagine that Moses walks into the academy of Rabbi Akiva. And guess what happens? He don't understand a thing. It's like Tai Chi, right? And he wonders, what has happened to my tradition? But this is exactly the tradition. The tradition isn't that we hold on to one paradigm forever. The tradition is that the paradigms shift. But what doesn't change? It's going to be one of our questions. And what does change? And that's what our conversation is going to be about. Everybody good so far? Okay, take a breath. Now we're going to change channels. You ready? We're going to go to our first paradigm shift. Are you ready? The Bible. The Bible? The Bible's tradition. The Bible's the most traditional thing we have. Oh, no, no, no. Not for us two. You see, first of all, let's understand the Bible. The book we call the Bible, which is not actually a book, it's actually 39 books stuffed together, was assembled over the course of 1,000 years. From roughly 1200 before zero, 1200 BCE, until around 200 BCE. And you can imagine that over the course of 1,000 years, things change. Events change, conditions change, politics change, and ideas change. And how does the Bible reflect those changes? So I want you to take a look at the Bible now, not as the book of tradition, but as a book of revolution. And we're going to show you two revolutions right in the Bible itself. The first revolution organized by a man named Joshua, and the second revolution organized by a man named Jeremiah. Professor.
So we're about to change.
Don't go change.
So this is now, hold on.
This is the paragliding tradition.
Yeah.
So I've become fascinated with Joshua. Now we pick up Joshua even earlier than when he becomes Moses' successor, as you recall, because he's actually tested. He's a test pilot, if you wish, because he's sent out to spy on this new land. And he's one of those who comes back, as you'll recall, with a kind of more favorable projective view, a kind of optimist perspective. So he's already in a good place. And he's seen by everyone as sort of the natural successor. So unlike some of the models we will be looking at, where we sort of see challenges and threats and intrigue, the Joshua story is less of that. It's really an extraordinary escalation of what leadership can mean and what transitioning leadership can be about. So here we go. So first, just a brief step back on transitional leadership, just to understand that it's like, we go through periods where we have a standing leader and then suddenly that leader is no longer. And of course, Moses represents that figure. He was seen as the essential leader for the story of exile and redemption and the building of a community. And he is to be removed from that role. And so it creates this extraordinary question of how comfortable the people will be, how comfortable the leadership will be in moving to and through this change to another central player. In some cases, these are intermediary leaders. So we can debate whether Joshua was sort of picked to sort of be in the betweens, helping to transition a people from being a kind of feudal tribal system to settling a land and beginning to create something called civil society in whatever forms it would take. But whatever ways we describe Joshua, this is a very smooth and very essential transformation and transition. And in doing so, it's kind of like a shared leadership. So unlike where we will see disruption and intrigue, here we see a kind of empowering of Joshua. And even in the interplay here, God is playing the role of a supportive transformer, allowing for, encouraging, and in providing for this important moment in the Jewish people's story. And from the book of Joshua itself, we draw the sense of how he is seen and perceived and is understood as an particularly appropriate person for a moment in the Jewish transformation. There's a kind of humility about Joshua, which is what intrigues a lot of folks. And so it's interesting that some biblical characters are taken out of context and studied, as is Joshua, by political scientists. So why would my discipline study Joshua? Because he was really an extraordinary manager, an extraordinary, with the extraordinary capacity to lead in a different environment than his predecessor and yet carry the people, the community forward in a way that did not create revolution, that did not create disruption. And so he's sort of modeled to folks who study political transitions as to what made this story work and why is he sort of an exception to some of those patterns we've seen elsewhere. So we look at Deuteronomy because in Deuteronomy there's a lot of referencing of this moment and of all that will happen in terms of moving this extraordinary figure of the Jewish people, Moses, out of that leadership position and bringing forward this emergent kind of transitional personality. So I thought this was particularly important because here there's a kind of ceremonial act. So in some cultures it's a political act, but in the Jewish faith tradition, this is almost a sacred, covenantal act. Single out Joshua, an inspired man, and lay your hand upon him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with the community, invest him with some of your authority so that the whole Israelite community may obey. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim before the Lord. By such instruction they shall go out, and by such instruction they shall come in, he and all the Israelites, the whole community. So there's this kind of almost emotional, covenantal spirit here about anointing and anointment of leadership. So this could have been disruptive, and it could have been extraordinarily problematic to our story, but it becomes a kind of eased and accepted formation of new leadership and governance. And it's also created in the context of setting a pattern for other leaders to transition. So it's more than just the Joshua story of taking a people to their new home. It is also role modeling for what would potentially be possible beyond Joshua. And so a reference to other leaders who will, at later points, be brought forward to lead a kingship or to create a new moment in the Jewish storyline. So one final word about Joshua. It is important that I think we appreciate that this is a biblical story, but it has so many characteristics to it where we are living in a time where there is such disruptive transitions of leadership, where one president would not recognize another, where one kind of leader seeks to indict or imprison another. So what we are observing in our own lifetimes, whether here in the United States or elsewhere in democracies or non-democracies across the globe, where we don't see this easy, natural transition of leadership, we can find in the biblical context as something that is affirming and reminds us that this is something we can teach. This is a value here. So if we want to build for what ultimately we want to share with our future generations and our belief about how do we move forward, one of the core lessons is that not all change need be disruptive and need be problematic, that some of this can actually be extraordinarily uplifting, even inspiring, as in the case of the Joshua venture.
Now you're going to see that one of us is good at PowerPoint and the other is good at Xerox. Pass these around. Pass these around, yes. One of us is adept with the new technology and one of us is an old-fashioned
Use this again, or should I?
guy. Pass these around, please. Take one, everyone. It should be enough for everybody. So Joshua, as Professor Mueller points out, Joshua represents a transition of leadership and a transition of paradigm shift that's smooth and organized, that is ritualized. There's a ritual that goes along with it that everybody accepts. Okay, so let's go over the history once quickly again. Moses takes us out of Egypt, or God takes us out of Egypt with Moses. You all know that story because it's the story of the matzah, right? We cross the desert over 40 years, says the Torah. And then just before he dies, Moses turns and invests Joshua, and there's that transition of leadership. Joshua is a different kind of leader than Moses. He's a military leader. And he leads us on a battle that enables us to conquer the land. Joshua conquers the land and settles the tribes of Israel in the land. And for the next 200 years, they live as tribes. There is no central government. So if you were to approach a Jew, an Israelite we'll call them, in the generations following Joshua, and say, who are you? Well, you would say that I am Edward, the son of Burton, of the Benjamin tribe. And if you said, are you an Israelite? I would say, well, yeah, I guess so, but I'm a Benjaminite. It's like if I ask you, are you a Western Hemispherian? You'd say, well, that's true about me, but that's irrelevant, right? Not one of us carries a card carrying, say, I'm a Western Hemispherian or a Northern Hemispherian. It happens to be the truth, but it's not part of my identity. When did that change? It changed in the year 1000, BCE, before zero, with a character named David. King David. King David does three amazing things. He gathers all the tribes of Israel and creates a nation. So after King David, if I said, who are you? You'd say, I'm an Israelite of the Benjamin tribe. He creates the idea of an Israelite. And by the way, he's so good at this that even to this day, little kids in my nursery school, tomorrow morning, will sit on the floor and sing, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. David, king of Israel, is alive and well. Now, if you're dead for about 3,200 years, and people still say you're alive and well, you made an impression. And the impression that he did was, he created the Israelite nation as an idea. That it wasn't an idea yet. He created it as an idea, and then he got that idea to be accepted. Now, he had two ways of getting it accepted. One is with persuasion, and the other is with a sword. David, truth be told, was a terrorist. He was a gang leader. So he said, how would you like to be an Israelite? You said, I'm not so sure. He said, how'd you like to live till Thursday? I think I'll be an Israelite. And that's really how it happens. And David establishes this nation of Israel. He conquers a pagan city called Shalem, and he establishes his city there, Yerushalayim. Jerusalem becomes his capital. It's the king's capital. He puts his palace there. He brings the Ark of the Covenant up and puts it next door. So now when you go sacrifice to God, you have to pay your taxes to the king. That's how you create a nation. David is really the nation creator. So when we talk about paradigm shifts, Steve has talked about the paradigm shift between Moses and Joshua, which was seamless. With David, it came really hard. And there were people who didn't like him. And there was a revolt against him. His own son revolted against him. And he establishes this idea of a nation state. And he conquers the local peoples, and he makes an empire. And his son Solomon takes over, and Solomon further expands the empire and creates a trading power, Trading, a trading power, out of Israel. So now if you were to interview an Israelite, they would say, well, I'm an Israelite. And you say, well, what makes you an Israelite? Well, I live in the land of Israel. I speak the language of the Israelites, Hebrew, right? I'm loyal to the king in Jerusalem. I pay my taxes to him. I worship the God of Israel. That's what makes me an Israelite. Everybody got that? And that was an idea that was invented. That was an idea that was invented. Now, an interesting thing happens next. When Solomon dies, the people are so angry at the taxes they had to pay because Solomon built the holy temple of Jerusalem. Now, I don't know about you, but the only way to build a ballroom next to the only way to build a temple in Jerusalem is to tax people to do it. And so he taxes the people terribly to build it. And when he dies, his son becomes king, Rehoboam becomes king, and the people come and they say, we will swear loyalty to you if you lower the damn taxes. And his son had bad advice. Sometimes leaders get bad advice. And the bad advice said, not only am I not going to lower your taxes, I'm going to double your taxes. The phrase in the Bible is, if my father whipped you with whips, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. Not good politics. Because what happens is the 10 northern tribes separate and they revolt. And they established their own king in a city called Samaria. And now, starting in that year, we have not one, but two Jewish kingdoms. The one I live in and the one I wouldn't be caught dead in. Where my sister-in-law lives, right? You understand? So this is what happens. And now your identity is even more complex. Because the question isn't, are you an Israelite, but are you a northern Israelite or a southern Israelite? Everybody got this? Still, you live in the land, you speak the language, you worship the same God. Everybody got this so far? Now, watch what happens. Something really interesting happens. The reason why David and Solomon were able to do all the things they did was because, are you warm? I am too. Should we just open the door? Just open the door, get a little air. Maybe open this door. Is that okay? No. Young people dancing, what could be bad? No, we're fine. I'll talk really loud. The reason why David and Solomon, leave it, it's okay. Louise, it's fine. The reason why David and Solomon were able to create the empires they created was because the two great empires of the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia to the north and the east, Egypt to the south and the west, were both in quiescence. They were not strong at that time. And that created a power vacuum, because we live right between them. Footnote: if you wanted to choose the worst place on earth to build a homeland, we did it. Now, the truth is, it's the best and the worst, to quote Charles Dickens. It's the worst place on earth because it's the busiest highway in all of human history. It's the highway between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And we live right on the damn highway. And whoever wants to control the world has to control the highway. So whoever has power is coming after us because we're the ones on the highway. On the other hand, culturally, it's the greatest place to live because we are the heirs, the inheritors of the great cultural traditions of both civilizations. Abraham is a Mesopotamian. Moses was an Egyptian. You see how that works? We are the heirs to both great genius cultures. So security, materially, tough place to live. Culturally, spiritually, amazing place to live. Go figure, right? So what happens? Up until now, the kingdoms of Israel are safe because the two powers are gone. But starting in about the year 745 before zero, we have the first great Mesopotamian empire, the first great global power. And it's called Assyria, not Syria, but Assyria. In Hebrew, Ashur. And these guys are vicious. They are really, and they want to control the world. And the way you control the world is by controlling the highway. So they take off and they begin conquering all the different city-states and little kingdoms that lived along the highway. Guess who that includes? Us. And in the year 722, the Assyrian Empire conquers the northern kingdom of Israel and destroys it. They take away. Now, the policy in those days was, in order to pacify a land and make sure they didn't become rebels, is you took the leaders away back to the imperial kingdom. And then the theory being that if you separate a people from its land, separate them from their culture, separate them from their language, they will quickly assimilate into the empire. Right? They'll be absorbed into the empire. So what happens? The leadership of the northern kingdom gets taken away to Assyria, and they disappear from history. That's what's known as the 10 lost tribes. They're not really lost. We know exactly where they are. And they didn't end up in Utah, okay? What happened was they went back to the imperial capital, it's called Nineveh, and they assimilated into Nineveh because there was no land and there was no language and there was no culture. And, you send your kids to the local public high school, and by, 2 years later, they're dating Assyrian girls and they marry Assyrian boys, and then pretty soon you've lost your Jewishness. Not unusual, right? So now we have the southern kingdom, which is Judea. And it persists for another couple of generations. And it goes through all kinds of permutations. There's a king named Josiah who comes in 640, and Josiah engineers a religious revolution to strengthen the culture and religious life of Judea. And at the same time, quite ironically, a man is born whose name is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet. And we'll talk about what that is in a moment. Jeremiah is born in Jerusalem. Anyone ever been to Jerusalem? You know the neighborhood called French Hill? It's just above the old city and a little bit to the west. That's where he's born. His family are priests, but they're not big-time priests. They're sort of small-time priests. And Jeremiah is born into this family. And Jeremiah is invested as a prophet when he's a very young man, because he can see what nobody else can see. He understands that the world has changed. And the Judeans didn't want to believe this. He understands that the world has changed, that we are now living in the age of empire. And that presents a problem of cognitive dissonance. How do you understand yourself when you call yourself the chosen people of the God of the universe, but politically, you are powerless? Politically, materially, militarily, you are a peripheral power. There's a great empire calling the shots. How do you live with that cognitive dissonance, with that contradiction? And he begins to understand in the course of his lifetime. And Jeremiah prophesies for a long time. And over the course of his lifetime, he understands, you know something? This arrangement, or shall we call this paradigm, of I'm a Judean because I live in Judea, I'm loyal to the king of Judea, I pay my taxes to the king of Judea, I worship the God of Israel in the temple of Jerusalem. This arrangement ain't going to go. Because you know what it is? It's ultimately vulnerable. It's vulnerable because one day that empire is going to come for us. And then what becomes of us? And so Jeremiah begins to formulate a plan. And it's a very subtle plan. And he spends a lifetime formulating this plan and introducing it, which is change the way Israelites think of themselves. Now, understand something. In the ancient world, there was no word religion. That word did not exist. It's just the way my people worship their God or gods. That word religion didn't exist. In the ancient world, culture, that word didn't exist. It's just the way we are, the way we do stuff. But Jeremiah can see that there are elements of Israeliteness that are not attached to the land, that are not attached to the king, that are not attached to a flag, that are not attached to an army. And he understands that if I can fix those and make them stronger, then even if we were to lose our sovereignty, even if we were to lose our land, even if we were to lose our king, we could still preserve who we are. So instead of thinking of ourselves as a political people, as a state, as a country that's sovereign, I want to think of us as a spiritual community, a cultural community, a religious faith. And that can survive any kind of politics we live under. Now, right away, you can see what I'm getting at here. You can draw a line of Jewish history from Jeremiah, who said, we don't need sovereignty. Sovereignty means we own our own country and we own our own government. We have political power. We don't need that across the generations of Jewish history until we get to the year 1897, when a man named Theodor Herzl is going to show up and say, we've spent all these generations and generations and generations without sovereignty. We need sovereignty again. The world has changed, and while we used to be able to survive without sovereignty, no more. Now we need sovereignty. Why do we need sovereignty? Because now they, the bad guys, actually do have the capacity to kill all of us. And now, if we don't have sovereignty, we have no way to defend ourselves against their hatred. And those are the two sort of bookends of Jewish history. Congratulations, you've just passed Jewish History 101. All of Jewish history is the arc between Jeremiah and Theodor Herzl. And in between, we're going to get some other characters that we're going to look at next week and the week after. So understand Jeremiah as a man who's trying to put forward feel better. As a man who's trying, oh no, go. You just take care of yourself. As a man who's trying to change the paradigm, the organizing concept of what it means to be an Israelite, to accommodate the fact that we now live in an age of empire when we have no effective political power. And I would tell you, by the way, parallel to where we are today, is part of what Israel is trying to figure out is now that we have political power, what's the paradigm? How do you fight a war? Right? I had a long talk with some high school kids today on how do you fight a Jewish war? Right? What does having power mean? Because for the last 2,000 years, we spent our time figuring out what not having power means. So here's the story. Jeremiah prophesies to the people again and again. A new kingdom arises called Babylon. Babylon, by the way, is Baghdad. To give you a sense of geography, the Babylonians, Babylon takes over from Assyria, threatens the kingdom of Israel, and eventually they're going to destroy it. But before we destroy it, let's listen to Jeremiah's words, okay? So early in his career, he's sent to the temple of Jerusalem. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah and said, "Stand at the gate of the house of the Lord and proclaim these words." In other words, go to the temple. In Jerusalem, there was a building called the temple. The temple was the center of religious life. It was the center of cultural life. It was the center of political life. It was the center of everything. Now, here's what's interesting about the temple. Okay, look at my timeline. 720, Assyria destroys the northern kingdom. 20 years later, they come and they besiege Jerusalem. 701. The Assyrians actually invaded Jerusalem. They besieged the city. The king was a man named Hezekiah. What? Right. He invades the city. He besieges the city. He's going to destroy the city. King Hezekiah doesn't know what to do. Should I fight these guys? I'm probably going to lose. Should I give up the city? They're probably going to kill me. What do I do? And there's another prophet at that time. His name is Isaiah. And Isaiah and Hezekiah had a relationship. So Hezekiah invites Isaiah and says to Isaiah, "What do I do?" And Isaiah tells him something really weird. Don't do anything. Now, it's really hard to tell a political leader, don't do anything. They don't want to hear that. But Isaiah says, trust me, don't do anything. Sure enough, according to the Bible, the next morning, Hezekiah wakes up, and the thousands and thousands of Assyrian troops that had been camped out on his front lawn are gone. The Bible says God sent a plague among them. We know from history that something else happened. The Assyrian army was led by their emperor. Back in the Assyrian capital, his son crowned himself king. There was a coup d'etat back in the capital, and the king decided to go back and reclaim his throne. In any case, somehow Isaiah knew this, and the kingdom was spared. It was spared. And people started to think, nothing bad can happen to us. Nothing bad can happen to us. Nothing bad can happen to us because we're God's people. This is God's house. This is God's city. Nothing bad can happen to us. And that was the ideology of the populace. Get it? Comes along Jeremiah. That was in 701. Jeremiah is now talking to them about 100 years later, right? And he says to them, everything bad can happen to you. What are you, crazy? But no one wanted to believe him. Here's his words, right? Hear the word of the Lord, all you of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, God of Israel, mend your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. You think you have a 5,000-year lease on this land, and no one can take you off the land. And I'm going to tell you that the landlord is watching you, And if you don't live up to his covenantal expectations, you ain't going to live here no more. I will let you live here. What do you mean, let us live here? You promised this land forever. No, I didn't. I promise you land forever if, that's a big word, if, by the way, because it changes the whole world. If you obey my law, if you mend your ways, I will let you live here. Don't put your trust in illusions saying, ooh, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Nothing bad can happen to us. No, if you really mend your ways and actions, if you execute judgment between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent, if you don't follow other gods, then I will let you live here. Now, you see the difference between the two forms of religion? There's a form of religion which says, I am blessed by God, nothing bad can happen to me. And the other form said, you're blessed, but only if you live up to the standard. Now, the other piece of this is, if you really want to get deeper into this, it's not just that he's telling them that the covenant is conditional. What he really is worried about is that the social separations of that society, the gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between the privileged and the unprivileged, the forlorn, was so vast that if we did have to fight a war against the bad guys, we couldn't do it. We couldn't gather enough collective strength and collective unity in order to stay alive as a people. We have so abused the social bonds among us that we're not able to really resist an enemy at this point. That's another way to think about it. If you rely on illusions which are no veils, will you steal and murder and commit adultery and swear falsely and sacrifice to Baal and father of the gods and then come and stand before me in this land, in this house, and say we are safe? Right? Just go to Shiloh. Shiloh was the shrine of the northern kingdom. And he says, what happened to them? They got whacked. You don't think you could get whacked like they got whacked? Right? And then here's this remarkable idea. And this is an idea he plants into their heads now, and he's going to spend the rest of his life teaching them. Listen to this idea. Thus says God, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the meat. For when I freed you from your fathers from the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice. You say, well, wait. Hello? The whole book of Leviticus is about this, about sacrifices. How can you say you didn't? He said, no, I don't really want sacrifice. God says, I don't really need your temple, and I don't need your sacrifice. What do I really want? What I really want is, do my bidding, that I may be your God and you may be my people. Walk in the way that I enjoin upon you, and it'll go well with you. But your ancestors didn't listen to me. In other words, what God wants is loyalty. What symbols you choose to reinforce that loyalty, to express that loyalty, that's up to you. You want to give me sacrifices? Great, give me sacrifices. You want to put tzedakah in the little blue box? Do that. You want to join the synagogue, make a large contribution to the rabbi's discretionary fund? Please do that. But it's up to you. You want to pray to me with words? Fine. In other words, God says, I don't need this city and I don't need this building. I just want your loyalty. Now that's going to be very helpful, because Jeremiah knows that if you put all your faith in a building, and there are people around the world who break buildings, who destroy buildings, that can be dangerous. And sure enough, as his life goes on, that message becomes more and more radical. Turn the page over. You ready? So this is 25 years later. The Babylonians are coming. The Babylonians are on the march. The Babylonians are coming to destroy Jerusalem. And Jeremiah says to the king, this is remarkable, listen carefully. It is I, thus says God. And this is Jeremiah talking to the king, who's putting together an army to resist the Babylonian invasion. He's got this army getting ready to fight against Babylon. And what does Jeremiah tell him? It is I who made the earth, God says, it is I who made the earth and the men and beasts that are on the earth, and my great might, my outstretched arm, and I give it to whomever I deem proper. I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. What? Wait. We're the Israelites. We're the Jews. We're God's people. And Jeremiah says, no, not now. You lost that. You lost that because you didn't behave properly. So I'm going to give your land to Nebuchadnezzar. I will even give him the wild beasts. All the nations shall serve him. The nation that doesn't serve him and doesn't put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, I will visit with sword, famine, and pestilence until I've destroyed it. Till I've destroyed the land. What does he tell them? Yes, the Babylonians are coming. Surrender. Put down your arms. Surrender. Because if they were to surrender to the Babylonians, what would they lose and what would they gain? I'm going to ask you this question. Look up. Everybody look up. Take a breath. What would they lose and what would they gain if they surrendered to the Babylonians? What? They could keep their land. They can keep their homes. They can even keep their temple. What would they lose? The pride of sovereignty. He'll probably charge them taxes. But heck, they were paying taxes to the king in Jerusalem anyway. In other words, he says, your power, your holding on to power is idolatry. You're worshiping your own power. It's an expression of your ego. And if I can be judgmental, it's a masculine thing. It's a guy thing. We guys don't like to say, okay, you're in charge. We like to be the boss. Right? And Jeremiah comes along and he says, that's fatal. If you do that, you're going to lose. Jeremiah knows something about the Babylonians that the kings in Jerusalem didn't know. That the Babylonians had overwhelming force. Way more than the Jerusalem kingdom could possibly have resisted. And so what he tells them is, give up sovereignty and live as a kingdom under God. We don't need sovereignty. We have a king. God is our king. So the Babylonian emperor, his picture will be on our money. So what? So we'll pay taxes. The IRS in Babylon, we'll pay taxes to them. We don't need sovereignty as long as we can stay alive as a spiritual people. How do you think that was received by the leadership in Jerusalem? Why? Why was it not received well? It's good advice. Would have saved the kingdom. Why didn't they listen to him? They lose their power. They lose their prestige. And you know what? Men don't like to hear that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to accuse the gentleman in the room. I happen to be one. Right? You give up sovereignty, you give up power, you give up your pride, you give up your ego, you save your life. Sometimes surrendering is a good idea, right? Jeremiah said surrender. You know what they did? They arrested him for treason. Because it was treason. Because his message undermined the morale of the troops who were getting ready to fight the Babylonians. And they put him in jail. And he lived 10 years of his life in jail as a traitor to the kingdom. They didn't kill him ultimately, but they've kept him in jail. But now think about what Jeremiah is telling us. What is he telling us? Stop thinking of us as Israelites defined by land, king. Start thinking of Israel as a spiritual, religious community. If you think about being a Jew in terms of land and temple and king, you make yourself vulnerable to the things the politics of the world. But if you think yourself as a cultural, spiritual community, hell, you can live anywhere. Yeah, it's going to be dangerous because you can't defend yourself. But you know what? If you stay quiet and you obey the law and you don't get in the way, they'll let you live. The king of Babylon had no interest in destroying Jerusalem. The king of Babylon had no interest in destroying the Jewish people. Right? Now, you're going to get pogroms and anti-Semitism, but this is the strategy that kept us alive from 586 BCE until the middle of the 20th century. I mean, just think of that. That's the strategy. What was our strategy? Leave history. Don't be a player on the world scene. Sit quietly, stay under the radar, make your own life, live in a ghetto, wherever they put you, right? And that's exactly what Jeremiah tells them. In 598, the Babylonians come and they take the first bunch of people away, including the king and the court. They appoint a puppet king. The puppet king rules for 10 years, and then someone convinces him to revolt against the Babylonians. Not a very good puppet. And so the Babylonians come back, and this time they're miffed. And they destroy the city, and they destroy the temple. That's the end of the first temple. That's the end of the Bible story, basically. And Jeremiah has one last message. He sends an email to the Jewish community that's going into exile. He talks to the community. What happened is the Babylonians did what the Assyrians did generations before. They took the leading citizens of Jerusalem back to Babylon. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept as we remembered Zion. That's them. They're going back to Babylon. And what does Jeremiah tell them? He could have told them, it's over. We have no land, we have no king, we have no temple, we have no pride, we have no ego, we have no army, we got no flag, we got nothing. It's gone. Give up, become a Babylonian. And we'd all be speaking Aramaic today and worshiping Baal or Marduk. But he told them something brilliant. Listen to what he told them. It's right here, chapter 29. This is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, and the rest of the elders of the exiled community, to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus says the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. So the first thing he says is, the reason you're in exile is not because Nebuchadnezzar's army is so much bigger and powerful than yours is. It's because you pissed off God, because you forgot the covenant. So understand that, because this is a God who never stopped loving you, which means if God can send you into exile, God could bring you back. That's the first point. Now listen what else he says. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. And seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in prosperity you shall prosper. For thus says the Lord, when Babylon's 70 years are over, I'll bring you home. He doesn't say what you think he's going to say. If it had been the old paradigm, he would have said, ladies and gentlemen, it's over. We have no land, we have no temple, we have no priest. God must hate us. The game's over. Go home and die. At least die as Jews. Go become Babylonians. Gesundheit. That's a Yiddish phrase, meaning go become a Babylonian. But he doesn't say that. What does he say? He says, we're still alive as a people. Listen to him. It's optimistic, right? Build homes and live there. Plant gardens and eat the fruit. Raise kids. Marry off your kids and bring grandkids. Live. Why can you live? Because Jewish is no longer land. Jewish is no longer temple. Jewish is no longer sovereignty. Jewish is no longer material power in the world. What is Jewish? Well, you know what else they did? You know what else they did that he didn't include here? They took all of the documents from the temple before it burned, and they edited them together, and they created a book. And that book became the center of the community. That book is called the Torah. The Torah was created, not written. It was written before, but it was put together. It was assembled as the core of the exile community in Babylon. Then you have a book, right? Well, if you have a book, what do you need? You need a place to keep the book and a place to gather to read the book. So they created synagogues. The synagogue was created as an expression of survival in exile, right? The synagogue. Wait, I have a book and I have a place to read the book and teach the book to my kids. I need one more thing. I need a time to do it. So when am I going to do it? They created Shabbat. They created Sabbath. In other words, they did what Jeremiah wanted them to do. They turned us from a political community, a polity, a state, a country, into a religion, a spiritual community, a cultural community that fought for its own existence, its own identity, even on foreign soil. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept as we remembered Zion, how can we sing a song of our city on foreign land? They figured out how. And sure enough, 70 years later, the Persian Empire supplants the Babylonian Empire, and there is still a self-identified Jewish community, in fact, a bigger Jewish community, a more powerful Jewish community. Because the wonderful thing about you Jews is that when we put you by the waters of Babylon, you didn't just sit and weep, you went and built communities, you built businesses, you built homes, you built institutions, you created a prosperous, powerful community. Frank, it was so prosperous and powerful that when 70 years passed and the Persian Empire said, okay, you can go back to Jerusalem, most of them said, no, thank you, we like it here. And that was the beginning of diaspora, which is another paradigm shift. The idea that you can live a perfectly legitimate, rich, meaningful Jewish life in Encino. Now, think about this a minute. To an ancient Israelite of King David's time, that would have been an oxymoron. How can you be far away from your land? How can you be speaking a foreign language? How can you be dressed like they're dressed? And the answer is, we can, because we got the book. And as long as our lives are revolving around the book, it's okay. And by the way, what does the book become for us? We're going to see this next week. The book becomes the replacement for territory. You actually know this. When we pray, if you're just praying somewhere in the world, which direction do you turn? East. Why east? Why east? Toward Jerusalem. And by the way, if you're in Jerusalem, which way do you turn? Toward the Temple Mount. There is one exception to that rule. There's one exception to that rule. Do you know what the exception to the rule is? If you're in a room that has a Torah scroll, you turn toward the Torah scroll. Think about that. In other words, where our Torah is, that's our Jerusalem. In other words, the book replaces territory. The book is where we live. And the book becomes the core of our identity that replaces land and material power. Spiritual power replaces material power. That was Jeremiah's brilliant invention. That is what we call a paradigm shift. Not everybody accepted it. Not everybody thought it was a good idea. Remember, he's in jail. They really didn't accept it. Right? That's what happens to revolutionaries. But you understand what happened. If he had lost the argument, we would have disappeared in 586. Because we lost the land, we lost the temple, we lost the king, we should have, right? We should have lost everything. The reason we survived was because you had a guy with a certain quality of genius who understood one thing. What got us here ain't going to get us there. The courage to rethink the whole people, its identity, its mission, its values, that quality of genius, of courage, and understanding what should change and what shouldn't change. In other words, the paradigm shifts, but what didn't change? We made the Torah out of the documents that talked about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron. That didn't change. The narrative didn't change. Just the accoutrements, the institutional structures changed, right? And the way that we worship changed. First we had sacrifice, then we had Torah learning and prayer, and now we have Tai Chi at 7:30 in the morning in Lululemon, right? Just think of that. I'm not kidding. Just think of that. That's quite remarkable. And so what Professor Windmill and I are going to have the joy doing in the next few weeks is we're going to take a look, we're going to walk through Jewish history and see how that genius expressed itself over and over and over again. And then we're going to ask, how can we use that genius today? The dates. I know you want to know the dates of this class. So if you have a calendar or a phone, listen carefully. You ready? Today is October 22nd. Next week is October 29th. Yes, we're meeting. Then, listen carefully. November 5th, we're not meeting. Ask me why. Go ahead. Because Idon Reichel is coming, this big Israeli rock star, and you should all come hear him, but bring earplugs. Except that it's sold out. So go on Spotify and listen to Idon Reichel. All right? No class on the 5th. Yes class on the 12th. Yes class on the 19th. No class on the 26th. Why? Because it's Erev Yontif. Right. Then our final class on December 3rd. So 10, 22, and 29, 11, 5, 12, and 11, 12, and 19, 12 and 19, and 12, 5, December 5th. Did everybody get that? I'll do it again. October 22nd and 29th, next week, yes. Then November 12th and 19th. Then December 5th. December 3rd. It's a Friday. Give me a break. It's a paradigm shift. All right, once again, ready? October 29th. This is for Douglas, right? November 12th and 19th. December 3rd. And then we'll have Christmas. Hanukkah. Okay, everybody got that? All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Professor, thank you. We'll see each other next week. Take good care.